Okay, everyone. Good evening, and thanks for being here. My name is Janet Forrest. I'm one of the adult programs coordinators at the Nantucket Athenaeum, along with my colleague, Daniel Griffin. And tonight we have a conversation on climate justice and climate change. And tonight we will be speaking in conversation, with Craig Altmos, who is the founding executive director of Better Future Projects, a project and the organizational home of Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, also known as CREW. And he'll be in conversation with Reverend Linda Simmons of the Unitarian Universal Meeting House here on Nantucket. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So Craig, would you like to begin and tell us a little bit about what CREW is and who you are?
Yeah, so I do have a presentation. Do we want to keep it casual or should I pull that up?
You can pull it up, that would be great.
That'd be great. Help us figure this all out.
So, let's see, so are folks able to see this?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. So, welcome everyone. So my name again is Craig Altmos. I'm here with Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, or CREW for short. And we are a program of an organization called Better Future Project that works with our sister programs 350 Mass and Divest Ed on building up the movement to address climate change. And CREW's work specifically is working to prepare people for climate impacts through hands-on education, service, and planning. And again, really looking at equitable, inclusive neighborhood climate resilience to climate impacts. And again, we want to lower the bar for climate resilience to make sure that the necessary adaptation, education, and participation are available to everyone, and particularly those who are least able to access that normally. So very quickly, I think as folks are aware, some of what we're facing with climate impacts, higher heat, which that means heat waves, droughts, wildfires, perhaps fewer wildfires here on Martha's Vineyard. But just this is for Boston, just to outline some of the impacts we can expect to see. In the later half of the last century, the Boston area averaged about 10 days a year where temperatures were above 90 degrees. I'm sorry, 11 days total above 90 degrees, and 1 day a year above 100. In the 2015 to 2044 range, this is the average of 2030, we're expecting to see about a full month of the summer be over 90 degrees with 2 days above 100. And as we look ahead to closer to the end of the century, we're looking at more over 2 full months of the summer being above 90 degrees. And several weeks of that being above 100 degrees. And this is where how much we reduce pollution now will have an impact on whether we're talking, over 2 months or under 2 months of post 90 degree weather, and how many weeks of 100 degree weather. And again, this is for Boston. So as Martha's Vineyard folks know, you do have a cooler climate here with the ocean, less of an urban heat island impact. So this will be lesser for residents of the island, but it still, I think, approximates the types of increases that you should expect to see. And this is just the overview for you all.
Craig,
Yes.
tell you quickly that we're Nantucket, not Martha's Vineyard.
Oh dear, thank you so much. I am so sorry.
Zoom does
Nantucket. My apologies. Nantucket. All right. Well, thank you, Reverend Linda, for that correction. And
a little bit of a competition between the islands, so I figured you better get that.
Yes. Right. No. I appreciate. I'd probably be booted out if folks had that power on the participant side. So thank you so much. And I am a substitute. My colleague Reverend Vernon Walker was supposed to be with you all here tonight, and I'm subbing in. So if there is any confusion around that, my apologies, and my mistake. Yes, so I think these hotter temperatures, these heat waves, these droughts, these wildfires are not only going to be hitting us, but also other parts of the world, other parts of the country, which will lead to migration, which for folks on Nantucket is a relevant consideration. And just to name, so in the 2080s, these are the annual temperature anomalies for Mexico, Central America, and the Dominican Republic, which, as you can see, it's supposed to get significantly hotter as the century progresses in Central America and Mexico, and similarly in the Southwest and in the West Coast, it's going to get much drier as well as hotter, so more droughts. And I think that it's for me, there's two notable things about why I focus on these two areas. One is that if we think about where you get most of your food from the grocery store, a lot of those food products have made in Mexico or made in California on them, or from Central America. And so I think we're going to see less food being produced in those regions. And so again, there will be issues of food insecurity for our region, and we need to think about other places to secure food, including growing it more locally. But also, I think we should expect to see more of a migration of folks from the West to the Northeast and from Central America and Mexico to the Northeast. The map didn't quite perfectly copy over here. And then another big threat that we are facing is water. So both more precipitation from rainfall, from superstorms, as well as sea level rise. So I ill prepared, and that's a link for sea level rise in Martha's Vineyard, which is totally irrelevant. So we'll skip that. And
prices will be similar on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. We share the neighborhood.
Indeed. But I have some percentages that I'd researched. So, but for us, again, a big part of what we say is that climate resilience is social resilience, and social resilience is climate resilience. In that the same threats that make people more vulnerable to COVID, for instance, so being people of color, being low income, being immigrants, also make people more vulnerable to climate change. And so I hope we have a chance to discuss those intersecting vulnerabilities and what we as a society can do to shore those up. A couple of offerings, opportunities for folks to get involved with Crew. We have community teams that work together to educate their communities and prepare them. On the bottom right is and the bottom left is one of my favorite activities, which is depaving, which is, that there are a lot of communities that have way more impermeable surfaces or paved surfaces, so that when the rains fall, it doesn't go into the ground. It instead just sits on top of the pavement or the concrete. And that also contributes to warmer weather, that or to heat island effects. Again, that when it's very hot, the concrete or the pavement absorbs heat during the day, and then at night, when you're hoping to get relief and cooling down, that pavement is now a heat source, and it releases heat into the air, and so you don't necessarily get the same relief at nighttime if you have pavement that's been heating up around your house or on your property during the day. And so depaving people's properties, where people have driveways that they're not using the full driveway, or they have paved patios, again, replacing that with green surfaces that can, instead of absorb heat, can help cool it down and can absorb water instead of adding to flooding. And then we also have resilience hubs of partnering with houses of worship and libraries on how they can work to make their communities more resilient. Happy to chat more about that offline. And then we also every September hold a series of events around called Climate Preparedness Week. In 2018, we had 35 events around the greater Boston area. 2019, we had over 130 across the state. 2020, we transitioned to a virtual scenario, so we're having about 50 virtual events this past September, but we will be having another September 24th to 30th Climate Preparedness Week 2021, and would love to invite folks to participate in that, to host events or attend events. I imagine we'll have hopefully a combination of in-person and virtual events for next year. So anyway, that is the quick version of who we are at Crew. If you're interested in getting involved, please feel free to visit our website at climatecrew.org, or to email me at craig@climatecrew.org. And looking forward to engaging in conversation now.
Yeah, so Linda, you're here on Nantucket, so could you put some of this into a local context for Craig? And from there, I'm going to let you guys just kind of go back and forth.
Yes, the intersectionality of climate justice and social justice and all of our lives becomes more and more apparent to us as the flashlight of COVID is shined into many places that we have forgotten to look. And on Nantucket, we don't suffer from the pollution of highways and factories and dirty water and the injustice of all the people who live near those places, which of course are cheaper to occupy homes in those places. And it's mostly people of color who occupy those dangerous places and suffer from the effects of climate pollution. But here, what we do have, who we are on Nantucket, is an island of many people, including many immigrants who are fleeing violence, poverty, pollution, dirty air, and water that we as Americans contributed to increasing, not only with the interruption of legal governments that wouldn't support US trade or production, but also in that vacuum of power. Gangs fill vacuums of power so often. And the insecurity of living in those conditions is enormous. I can't imagine, but I have heard so many of our Nantucketers talk about this. So when I think about climate change and climate resilience, so as if I understand you right, Craig, it's getting to know each other better as communities, getting communities to become one community, so that as we face any trauma, and of course, many of them are connected to climate change, we know each other, we know our neighbors, we know what we need, and we can be good neighbors. And so here on Nantucket, the Unitarian Universalist Meeting House, where I'm a minister, established the Immigration Resource Center after the election of our current president. So many were rightly afraid of what would happen in this administration. I think many of their worst fears have come true. And so we have this team of people, UUs, atheist, people from the Baptist and the Catholic. We have a big group of people. And we work we have pro bono lawyers, and we work to help immigrants, feel seen and heard, and also try to find the resources and the materials they need to get further along in the process from, as they say, from living in the shadows. So as I thought about all of this, I thought, I think the intersectionality for Nantucket, even with all the work I've done with immigrants and immigration lawyers and a migrant and refugee committee on Nantucket that I belong to, it struck me writing this, I've never invited any of these people to my home. Of course, during COVID, that would be more complicated, but long before COVID, I never said, come for dinner, or made it available that they would invite, gave that sense that they could invite me. And I thought, what a terrible loss, that I say we're friends, but I've never invited you to sit at my table. And I think that particular, though we're a very tiny island, there are so many communities that live here, and so few of us know each other. So I was thinking, as you were talking about crew, that perhaps it would be a use, some of the great work you've done and the tools and the skill sets you've developed could help us here kind of set a table for all of us. So those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, well, I did want to just highlight again the interconnectedness of our society. I live in the town of Somerville, the city of Somerville, here in Massachusetts, and I was very surprised that actually I rode an ambulance with a friend who worked for the city's ambulance, or actually worked for a private contractor that supported the city. And so Somerville is a city of 80,000 people. Do you know how many ambulances we have stationed, ready to respond at a given time in Somerville to serve 80,000 people? Do you want to take a guess, Linda?
No. I'm not in the mood to be foolish.
Fair enough.
Tell me.
3.
Oh my goodness.
There are 3 ambulances for the city of Somerville that regularly on call at a given point. And it turns out that for a population of 80,000 people, which I don't know how that relates to Nantucket. Do you know how many people live on Nantucket?
There's
I guess it depends on the season.
Well, the year-round community is a contested number. many of our folks don't feel comfortable filling out the census for various reasons, so it is difficult to get an official count.
Sure,
I think it's like 15,000 on the books, and we all think, just anecdotally, maybe 20 is more true. Um,
sure.
but again, it's hard to get an accurate count.
Great. So perhaps you maybe have the same number of ambulances. I mean, I think one advantage that Somerville has as a, um, you know, not as a landed terrestrial non-island community, is that, you know, if you look at, for instance, the Boston Marathon bombing, right, that a lot of ambulances were able to come in from surrounding cities into Boston to provide support. But it turns out, again, for your average day, that 3 ambulances is actually enough to cover the accidents that happen in a city the size of Somerville. But I think what that doesn't cover is when you have an extreme weather event like a heat wave or a hurricane that doesn't just affect Somerville, but also affects Watertown and Arlington and Cambridge and Boston. And similarly for you all, again, it's harder for help to get to you all, right? And so they say that when there's actually a big widespread disaster, the actual first responders are not going to be the ambulance or the fire department or the police, but they will be your neighbors. That they will actually be the first people to arrive, you know, if there's danger. And so being in good relationship with your neighbors is really critical from a selfish survival perspective for when these disasters do hit us, and for an altruistic perspective when we think again about the most vulnerable among us, knowing where are the folks in our community, the elderly people who may be living by themselves, you know, that we can check in on proactively, or people who may have physical limitations, who would really need assistance. Or undocumented people who may be afraid for various reasons to come out and to get official government assistance. How do we identify where those folks are so that if there is, God forbid, or when there is a disaster, that we have systems in place, that we know who is going to reach out and help who, and who wants to proactively sign up for that help in advance. One of the big models that we, sorry, were you going to jump in?
Finish your thought, please.
Well, one of the models, one of the unfortunate models that we use for thinking about, you know, societal interventions around disasters, it is about a heat wave that hit Chicago in 1995. That was studied by a scholar named Eric Kleinenberg, who's now over at NYU, who did his dissertation on this. And he did a neighborhood, and sorry, so that heat wave was a very bad heat wave. It killed over 700 people in Chicago that summer. And they did a neighborhood by neighborhood analysis and found that that poverty was not a sufficient predictor of who died. That it was primarily elderly people living by themselves, who died in that heat wave. But neighborhood by neighborhood, it was not just the poorest neighborhoods that had the greatest fatalities and the greatest casualties from that, but it was actually you know, the combination of poverty and social disconnectivity. That there were some neighborhoods, including actually some immigrant neighborhoods, that because of that shared bond of being recent immigrants and being in a strange place and sharing that language, that those neighborhoods actually did better because they were more likely to check in on each other. And so even if you were, say, you know, an elderly Polish American who'd been living in this Chicago neighborhood for many, many years after the Polish neighborhood had mostly become a Salvadorian neighborhood, that the presence of that tightly connected Salvadorian community actually bled over into the Polish Americans surviving that heat wave better than, say, an African American community nearby that was an African American neighborhood that had been an African American neighborhood, and that because of various systemic racism and other issues, you know, did not have robust social connectivity. They didn't have that same shared recent immigrant experience. And so whether they were African Americans, Polish Americans in that neighborhood, they were much less likely to make it through than other places where there was this proactive sense of, well, let's check in on, see how the neighbors are doing. Because heat waves can be very deadly, but actually the intervention, saving lives, is actually pretty simple. You just have to get to people soon enough when you realize that they're getting hot, and you put them in a cool bathtub. You make sure they're drinking enough water, or you call 911 and you get an ambulance to come and give them an IV drip to make sure that they're getting the liquid they need and getting them to an air-conditioned space. And yeah, and so for us, again, it's really all about how do we proactively build those ties now, because we know that these types of disasters are coming. There are hurricanes headed to
Uh-oh.
Nantucket. There are heat waves headed to Nantucket. It's a matter of when they come, not if. And so how are we to secure our communities and make sure that the most vulnerable are taken care of?
Thank you, Craig. And I mean, we have a crisis happening right now with COVID-19.
Indeed.
And my experience, I can't speak for the whole island ever, but in my experience, knowing each other within groups, right? We know each other. I know all the church congregants, for instance. And here I find that our communities live in these separations. And we're this small island, but we don't, if you're from here in this tiny island, you don't often go here to do such and so. So my assessment is that we really need to cross those invisible borders. I don't mean to suggest that they are borders of racism. I think they're borders of habit. And yeah, sure, systematic racism is always part of that habit, isn't it? That there's those kinds of invisible walls, certainly white privilege. And when I say white privilege, I don't mean to cause us to cower our heads in shame, who are white. I mean to say it's imperative that we own this privilege and take responsibility for it. There's so many gifts. Every day I say, I'm so great when I'm out running. I'm so grateful that I'm running here in this beautiful, and then I think of my new sneakers and my strong, that I've had health care that has kept me strong, and that I'm a minister on Nantucket. The layers of privilege are important to remain cognizant and grateful for. So here I think the issue is, I think elders are well cared for here within the communities of care. And it would be, for instance, during COVID, many of the island immigrants who are undocumented and who live here, of course, didn't get a stimulus check or any unemployment checks. Also due to systematic racism, most of the immigrants here are service workers of one kind or another, and that is the very kind of work that, of course, was limited. And so we got a community foundation grant for $40,000, the Immigration Resource Center, to pay bills, and yet our ability to know where to go to let people know about that program is so limited. It really helped us, we who have been working in this area now for 4 years, it really helped us notice how much more we have to do, that we don't know. We are sure there is the need, but we still have money left over. Yes, that money should have, from the stories we are hearing, that money should have been gone long ago. And so again, it's knowing who the people are, and what they need and how. Well, if we were neighbors, if we knew each other, I would just pop over to that neighborhood and say, with all the flyers, and say, hey, So it's that. We have a question here. Can we learn from the COVID experience about communication on island as we prepare for more threats, especially those related to climate change? What communication lessons can we take away and build on? And for me, I was thinking that very thing. Thank you, Sarah, for that. How can we become more aware? How can we contact each other easily? How can we ask, are you well? Do you need anything, without and allow other people to ask that of us too, right? This isn't about saving anybody. We do this together, or none of us are saved, in my sense of this.
Yeah, well, I do want to pull a very big lesson for me from COVID, before pivoting to the communication specifically, which is that there was a very valiant effort by a bunch of Boston public health professionals, as we were worried about the lead up to the coming shortage of ICU beds. That there was explicitly, they said that doctors and nurses should not consider any of a long list of factors, including race, disability, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, ability to pay, immigration status, or incarceration when creating a prioritization list for who gets access to these beds. They really want it to be a race neutral criteria. Unfortunately, and so really they only looked at, do they have pre-existing conditions? Do they have chronic illnesses or conditions? And what is the age of the patient? And that was meant to determine who had priority access to the ICU. Sorry.
Craig, I want just to quickly say before I'll forget by the time you finish that all of those distinctions you just made, the rate of comorbidities in people who are people of color, et cetera, are so much higher than people who live in white communities. So although we say, and rightly and justly and morally, that this will not be a distinguishing factor, it is the Black American community, African American community has higher rates of high blood pressure and diabetes and obesity, all because of, well, systematic racism, access to resources. So yeah, it seems ingenuous to me that this statement. Does it to you?
Yes, no, sorry. That was the exact point that I was going to make. That was the intention, was to say that race is not going to be a variable for this. But unfortunately, so one of the things that we are learning about society is environmental racism.
Right.
And if you look at white communities versus communities of color in Massachusetts, your average white community has 2 hazardous waste sites for every square mile, and about 19,000 pounds of chemical pollution released annually. By comparison, your average community of color in Massachusetts has 48 hazardous waste sites per square mile instead of 2 that are found in white majority communities, and 200,000 pounds of chemical pollution released annually instead of 19,000 pounds. And so I think that to me just really crystallized that you can't just take a race neutral approach to things and say, okay, we're going to treat everyone equally, because people were not raised in equal circumstances. They did not, breathe the same air and drink the same water as each other. And so exactly as you identify, people of color are more likely as a result to have asthma, to have cancer, to have high blood pressure, to have all of these comorbidities that then disadvantages them in that race neutral approach. But so in terms of communication specifically, I think honestly, COVID for me, honestly threw us for a loop, because we were really planning to lean in on in-person communication and in-person gatherings as a big part of our, social resilience response. But I will say, actually, I think that one of the things that it has encouraged me to think about is, like, as much as we look at the high-tech ways of keeping in touch, like doing Zoom calls, is how do we actually reestablish some of the lower tech ways of literally doing a door-to-door canvas in the same way as a census, right? Of going to every single household on the island, setting a goal for a team that over the next 2 years, 3 years, we will knock on every single door and have a conversation with folks about what impacts of climate change we might expect, and do you want to be part of helping to provide services in that time, or are you interested in receiving a service during that time? I think also phone trees. When I was a child, before the time of email, or we could just go online to see if the soccer game was rained out, we would have a phone tree where one person would get the call from the league that the game was canceled, and they would call 2 parents, and then who would then call 2 parents. Each of them would call 2 parents until after, a couple of cycles, you'd have every family would be called, notified that the soccer game was canceled because of the rain. And so I think, like, building in some of those types of communications technologies, those systems, I think is really important. And I also, unfortunately, I think it is actually really important for us to also think about, again, how do we learn from this pandemic so that we are better prepared for the next pandemic? Because unfortunately, climate change is melting ice that contains frozen bacteria that has been frozen for tens of thousands of years, that modern humans are no more prepared to deal with than the Native Americans were when the European colonialists brought all of those diseases over with them and decimated the Native American populations. We similarly have been separated from many of these bacteria and viruses. I have a friend who recently married a Siberian woman, a native to Siberia, and he gave me a piece of mammoth tusk of ivory, basically. That ivory is normally illegal because of poaching, but it's actually legal to be sold from now in Russia from these melting ivory tusks that are being brought into the world for the first time in tens of thousands of years. I just saw an article about a cave bear, an extinct species of bear that's been extinct for, again, well over 12,000 years, that thawed out where its nose was fully intact. And so I think about if an entire nose can make it tens of thousands of years, how much can little tiny bacteria, little tiny virus cells survive and then be released in this world? So again, I think that this pandemic may well be a trial run for us of other pandemics. And so thinking through at Sarah's question about how, what do we learn from this, not both for climate impacts that we think of, more traditional ones like sea level rise, heat waves, and superstorms, but also for future pandemics that climate change may bring.
Thank you, Craig. And I was thinking about this neighborhood piece, and that we have surely learned through this time of COVID in ways that we shamefully didn't know before, but nonetheless, how much we all rely on one another. And, Amazon workers say that it's like going to work without equipment, going to war without a shield to go into Amazon and work. And how much have we learned, how deep our connections and our threads are. Of course, the way we value and pay those connections and threads must be changed. But here on Nantucket, when you said we should knock on people's doors, I'd just like to lift up that, ICE does come to Nantucket from time to time. And the fear in our immigrant community is very high, as temporary protective statuses have been lifted. These are people who have come from Central America here due to natural disasters and wars, and they were protected from being, deported, and that status has been revoked for the first time in many, many years. So people are very even us on the Immigration Resource Center, and we have people who are immigrants on this. We have people who speak Spanish and Portuguese. We've developed this in liaison with the whole community. And even so, I think 3 years it took before people started feeling comfortable to walk into the doors of a church. I mean, this is just to explain. People have said to me, who had a TPS status revoked, as they have been, and who has children on island, I can't take them with me. I can't bring them into that world that I barely know anymore. I've been here for 20 years, So, but what does come to mind is, when we first opened the Immigration Resource Center, we popped around to all the churches on island that were primarily immigrant churches in Spanish or Brazilian or primarily Jamaican gatherings, and told them what we were doing, and we had people but we first stayed for the whole worship service. I mean, I've been saved so many times now. We stayed for the whole worship service, and I think that we are too used to, as people of privilege, white people of privilege, thinking, here's this information, let me knock and offer it to you. And that I think it's time to imagine, how can I learn who you are better without overtaxing you within the context within which you live. And it's a more authentic. Nonetheless, I still haven't, as I said, had dinner at my table with some of the folks that I care so deeply about. But it allows a context to be developed and trust to be earned. And when I think about my last piece about this is, for me on Nantucket, this is a very relevant piece, how the immigrants here are part of this intersectionality of climate justice and social justice. And, so many immigrants around the world, this environmental refugees who, trying to keep up with the mad demands of Americans, where the factories have been exported and because labor is cheaper, because they don't get paid health insurance or have any environmental safety, and that they come to the shores um, for people who declared their lives were worth less than profit, and that to seek refuge in the land they worked to supply with their country's natural resources and labor. And we turn them away. We call them criminals, make them into a new invader in some ways. And it was their toil and sacrifice in so many ways that helped so much that we hold dear become possible. And so I think perhaps not being strangers, learning how not to be, what it means to not be a stranger, I think would be a good step for us all.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I do see there a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I do really just want to lift up the justice or the injustice around migration and immigration. And I mean, I think you've alluded to, the role of the U.S. government in destabilizing certain regions of the world and undermining, in many cases, democratically elected governments, and creating power vacuums that gangs have filled in, which I think is absolutely true. And we've also undermined not democratically elected governments, but still, resulting in chaos and disorder and civil war. But on climate change specifically, I mean, there are so many people around the world who have had no say at all in the climate crisis, where they have very minimally at all used fossil fuels, and yet their crops are drying up, their oceans are rising, superstorms are battering their homes, in many cases physically destroying their homes, floods again destroying their crops. Again, through no fault of their own. They were not the ones that said, let's own a bunch of Humvees and drive them around for fun. They were not the fossil fuel executives that chose to lie about climate impacts, to deny that it was happening, to fight against efforts to pass renewable energy legislation through our legislature and Congress. And then after we have made their homes less hospitable, they seek refuge on our shores and are met with hostility, met with hatred, told that they don't belong here, that they should be turned away. I think, again, as privileged people, we don't really appreciate how difficult a choice it can be to leave your home. If you and your parents and their parents grew up in the same villages, and everything is that land and that people and that culture, to pick up everything and leave is usually a very hard choice, and is really only made when there is a real need to leave, when there's immense struggle. And I think one of the gravest injustices I think we are going to see is this massive migration from climate change. And I think, unfortunately, I hope that I'm wrong, and I will work hard to be wrong. But the developed countries not opening with welcome arms to meet those who we have required to leave their homes, because the truth of the matter is that climate change is going to be worse. It's going to get hottest in the places that are already warmest and hottest, along the equator, which is mostly developing countries, and it's the richer world that is in the northern and southern latitudes of Australia, the US, Canada, Europe. But because we have the parts of the world that are more hospitable to human life and to agriculture, in 50 years and even in 10 years, again, and even now, we have a responsibility to welcome those folks. And it's particularly ironic for a country that is a country of immigrants, as the United States is. The George Washingtons of their day did not have immigration papers. They didn't go through customs the legal way. There was no Native Americans did not officially welcome folks in and say, yes, you're legal residents now. We just came, white people just came to this continent to claim it as our own. And so for us to be so unwilling, so unwelcoming to, for others who have such a dire need to be here, I think it is really unfortunate.
I have a Janet, did you want to say something?
I was just going to chime in and let you know we have some questions, but you go ahead.
I was just going to say something quickly, which is my husband and I spent some time at Casa del Migrante in Tijuana, and lived there for a time. It's run by some monks, Scalabrini monks from Italy, whose welcoming the stranger is their greatest theological mission. And we met so many people there fleeing violence from so many places who had walked. I wish Carrie was here to remind me. 5,000 miles with little children. Their feet would be swollen, and the stories they would tell us, being dropped in Brazil and walking through the forests of Colombia and being robbed of all their things and not being able to start a fire because of fear of attracting people they didn't wish to attract, and walking up to their necks in water after the jungle to cross into the next place. And they were seeking asylum, which we know this was only last year that we were there, seeking asylum and being denied and denied and denied. And with these little children, women who had come from being raped and threatened by gangs, or their children who were threatened. I mean, it was extraordinary to witness and to experience and to feel these stories, right up close. And I found myself saying, I'm sorry so often. Please forgive us. I found myself saying that so often. So I just wanted to lift up that anecdote.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Janet.
Yeah, okay, we have a couple questions here. This is from Valerie. How do we get people to reduce their use of fossil fuels when there are so many climate change deniers out there?
I can take a first stab at that. So first off is that I think actually we don't really need to persuade the climate deniers that they're actually a pretty small percentage of the population. Thankfully, it's a single percentage of the population now denies the climate is changing. The people who are the hard deniers, who are very entrenched in that perspective. The vast majority of us accept the science that the climate is changing, that humans are responsible. There's some percentage who are unsure, but not strong-willed, opponents to that concept. But I think the bigger question is how do we get people generally to reduce our use of fossil fuels? My preferred solution is through policy. I actually only learned fairly recently that the very term carbon footprint was actually coined by British Petroleum, by BP, as an effort of deflecting responsibility away from the fossil industry. They spent like a $30 million advertising campaign to get this idea of carbon footprint out there, so that each of us would be worried about how much am I flying, how much am I driving, how much single-use plastic am I buying, instead of saying, wait a second, like, why is my car being fueled by gasoline? Why is this plane being fueled by gasoline? Why are they selling single-use plastic items to begin with in the store? Why am I being forced to have to choose between getting nutrients into my body and using plastic, or missing out on that opportunity and not using plastic? Obviously there are ways around it, but the default right now is very much to use fossil fuels, whether those are in the form of plastic products or in energy. And I actually don't own a car. My wife, we're actually expecting our first child this summer, so we got an air conditioner for the first time in the 10 years we've been in this apartment, and only used it a couple days this summer. So I do try really hard to minimize my personal contribution to climate change. But at the end of the day, we're not going to beat climate change by having those of us who are thoughtful about this do our best. Because even me at the margins, like I've maybe cut my pollution maybe half of what the average American has, and that's probably generous. But even if I've done half, I'm still contributing to climate change for that other half, right? And I'm not going to get there's not that much more obvious stuff I can do beyond that. And we're not going to we didn't end slavery by persuading every single slaveholder to free their slaves. We ultimately needed government policy to say, this is wrong, and we're going to stop it whether or not you agree. And I think it was born out of desperation out in California with all the wildfires they've been having. The governor recently announced that starting in 2035, which is, in my opinion, much too late, they're no longer going to allow new cars to be sold in California that have internal combustion engines. So starting in 2035, if you want to buy a new car, it will have to be an electric vehicle. And those are the types of policies that we need to start implementing, again, faster than 15 years from now. To just say, like, the new default is that if you want to drive somewhere or if you want to power your home, you will not be contributing to someone else's death in order to do that, which is what we are currently doing right now. When you turn on a light, if you're using fossil fuels, you are contributing to people in Central America, in South Asia, in the Pacifics, here in the US. You're contributing to the increased likelihood of people dying by using that energy. And that's wrong. It's particularly wrong when we have the technology. We know how to get energy from the sun, from the wind, from the water. We don't need to be digging up these ancient, dinosaur decomposing bits of carbon and burning them. That was helpful for our society for a while. We've experienced those benefits. It's time to leave that behind and to move on. So I do really think, again, the answer is policy change. That said, if you are talking to someone who is a little bit skeptical, I think a couple of things I would point to is that, one, the U.S. military is actually a very big on taking action on climate change. The Pentagon calls climate change a threat multiplier. It takes existing tensions and makes them worse. And right now, the United States military is actually the only organization in the world that's capable of responding to disasters. When there's a massive hurricane that hits the Philippines or Indonesia, and islands that used to be connected are now isolated and need emergency supplies dropped in, the U.S. military is the only organization in the world that's able to drop in those supplies at the drop of a dime. And they realize that they're being more and more taxed. They're asked to do that type of relief work more and more as natural disasters proliferate across the world. And again, they also recognize that as droughts and floods and hurricanes proliferate, as food gets harder to grow, there's going to be more disruption to governments, to societies. That's, again, increases the opportunities for terrorism, for gangs. So the military is very big on taking action on climate change, on reducing our addiction to fossil fuels. And then also, again, faith communities. Every single organized faith in the world, every mainline Protestant branch, the Catholic Church, the Pope, the Dalai Lama, every main Jewish branch, every main Muslim branch, every main Buddhist branch have all gone on everything that has an organization, every faith that has an organization has gone on the record saying the climate is changing, humans are responsible, and we should do something about it. And so if they're not going to listen to the scientists, if they're not going to listen to the military, if they're not going to listen to faith leaders, who do they see as objective purveyors of truth on this topic? And I think that it's a pretty short list of folks who are on the other side.
And thank you, Craig. And I think I would add, 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions are created through meat and dairy production. And, I agree with everything you've said, Craig. And I think if we, instead of thinking about perhaps the people who deny climate, it's true we can only turn on a light, huh? We haven't got another solution, but they're beginning and they're very expensive, and we see the class divisions in there too. But I think about becoming a vegan. I quit meat during COVID, hearing about the meat packaging plants and people who were being required to risk their lives, and if they didn't come to work, they were being fired. And I read an article by Naomi Klein that said amputation is an acceptable risk at a meat packing plant. So when I put this all together, I think perhaps it is so. We have to keep voting and insisting and speaking, and perhaps we could change the way we eat. It's quite a radical act, I think. I mean, I had a much different diet pre-COVID. So it does seem, though I do agree that personal responsibility is accentuated, I think, to deflect corporate and government responsibility. And yet, I do believe we have some personal responsibility and should act on it.
For sure. And I call myself a meat minimalist. I'm not a vegan or even a vegetarian, although I was a vegetarian for a while. But beef and pork in particular are very bad for climate change, and so I've completely cut pork out of my diet. I eat beef a couple times a year, and again, so I could knock it out those other couple times. But I think again, I think to your point though, that those meat packing plants are not going to go away purely by those of us who are enlightened choosing veganism. That there's enough demand for meat that those plants will stay in business until and unless there's government policy saying that it is unacceptable to count amputation as an acceptable casualty. That if there's an amputation in your meat packing plant, you are shut down for 6 months. And if you pass that law, then there will immediately be all these new safeguards guaranteeing that people's arms are not chopped off. And similarly, passing laws and regulations to ensure not just look after the meat workers, but also the animals themselves that are being kept in very inhumane conditions. But absolutely. But I think in the meantime, I think one of the ways we can call attention to that is making personal lifestyle choices and using those choices in conversations at Thanksgiving dinner and casually with friends to call attention to these issues. But I do firmly believe that we do ultimately need policy change to really get at the heart of these as much as individuals can and should do as they're able. I do see there are a couple other questions.
Janet, what do we have next? You're muted, Janet.
I'm sorry. We do have another one from Valerie. What can people on a local level do to help counteract the effects of global warming and sea level rise in their own communities? And actually, related to that, there's another question. How many examples are there of Massachusetts towns passing laws to reduce their footprints?
You want to go first in either of those, Linda? Or?
This is all you.
Okay.
Your area.
Yes. So I think for both, I would say. I think honestly, to counteract the effects is difficult. I do think again that individuals. I think one of the things that I did mention, depaving is an option of trying to make sure that there's as much as possible you're absorbing water instead of heat, and you're absorbing water and not absorbing heat, and removing those surfaces that absorb heat and prevent you from absorbing water. Again, I think that for individuals, there's not much more that we can do. Again, I think looking after your vulnerable neighbors, but the oceans are going to rise. We can't stop that. You can build seawalls, but that's not going to stop the oceans from rising. And the seawalls ultimately will get inundated. You may buy yourself some time, but the waters are going to keep rising and rising and rising over the next 50 to 500 years, depending on how quickly things melt. But there are many towns in Massachusetts have absolutely passed laws to reduce their footprints. One of the more recent policies that has gained favor is called community choice energy, where cities and towns have the ability to actually negotiate as a block with the utilities. And this actually, both in many cases, allows them to negotiate lower prices, but also to say we want more renewable energy. So right now, utilities are required to I think about 15% of the energy they buy is required to be renewable. And there are towns I know the city of Lowell, the city of Newton, both passed laws, passed community choice energy regulations, and negotiated with their energy utility to say, we actually want you to go, I forget the exact amount, but it was 68% renewable, and for cheaper than we were paying before. But by negotiating as a block, they were able to reduce prices and dramatically increase the amount of renewable electricity that was being served to their population. So that I think is a really, really great policy. The city of Lawrence recently passed or used some money that they had to make several bus lines in Lawrence free for people to ride. So instead of which again I think has equity implications, that people who use the buses tend to be low income folks, and so you're able to help out financially those at the lower end of the income spectrum, while also again by making them free, you increase the likelihood people are going to take the bus instead of drive their cars, get people off the roads, which has great climate benefits. And I know that City Councilor Michelle Wu in Boston is very much seriously looking at doing the same for the city of Boston as she looks to run for mayor in the next election. But yeah, I think lots of places are installing electric vehicle charging stations, and looking to do more weatherizations in their city. The Mass Save program actually has really great opportunities for people to go directly to the state to get free energy audits to find out how you can reduce energy consumption in your own home. The city of Brookline recently passed an ordinance that attempted to ban new natural gas hookups from new properties being developed, and instead to require them to be all electric buildings. That actually was challenged legally, and I think that there's efforts being done to work around those challenges, but requiring again new buildings to be all electric. People, some city and towns have passed have made it so that new high schools, for instance, under construction are again LEED certified, all electric, so that the big municipally owned properties that the city directly controls is able to have virtually no carbon input, or carbon output rather. So there's a lot of great stuff that cities and towns are doing, and that definitely encourage folks to look at what Nantucket can do that you're not already. But I think like the macro level, what we need to do is to shift over heat and transportation to become electric. And we need to make all of that electricity then come from renewable sources. So from wind and from solar primarily. And couple that with, again, reducing how much we're consuming across the board. So reduce transportation by building out public transit, by making walking and biking more accessible and safer. And again, just reducing the amount of things we're consuming, reducing the amount of energy that we need by having more efficient appliances and being thoughtful about how many times we're buying stuff from Amazon that we don't really need. But macro level, that's what we need to do is reduce what we consume, electrify everything, and make that electricity clean and renewable.
Amen.
We do have a comment from Mary. She says, FYI, Nantucket has formed a sustainability working group that has been delayed due to COVID. Nantucket does have a power choice program that has negotiated lower electric pricing and higher renewable use. And Nantucket is also has a coastal resiliency advisory committee working on a coastal resilience plan due out at the end of 2021.
That is great to hear. Not terribly surprising. It seems like Mary could have been a great panelist here today as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that's honestly a really nice thing about this. That there are so many people worried about this problem and doing their darndest to address it. And clearly there are lots of good folks working on this in Nantucket. And that personally does give me hope, knowing that how many of us are really actively trying to wrap our heads around this and to charge head forward and to bringing on that better future that we all need and deserve.
Yeah, with that, I think we'll wrap up. Linda, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I think it's a hard time to feel like a good enough human being. That's just, I'm just noticing that in my own life and in other people's lives. The world around us reflects an image back to us that's hard to see ourselves in. So my final word is, of course, not my final word, but my next word will be take care of each other and take care of yourselves, and look for small, bright, and beautiful spots and fill your soul with them. There's so much to be done. And if you're here right now, you're already doing so much of it. I know that. So take care of yourselves, be good to each other, and make new friends across divides. I think that's in the end what will save all of us. So
thank you. Craig, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I very much echo what Linda said. I think if you're on this call, you're obviously someone who already cares and is probably already doing a lot. But yeah, I just I like to kind of take things at the 10,000 foot level and just think about, just what a unique moment in human history this is, where people a generation ago didn't really understand what we were doing to the planet's climate, and people for the next 50 generations will be dealing with the consequences of our decisions, and we have the privilege and the responsibility of being alive in this moment where we have the knowledge and we have this increasingly small but still present window to act. And again, for those of us on the call, if you're on Nantucket and you're understanding the English very well as your native language, you're probably in a more privileged class, not just alive in this moment, but probably a white person in the United States of America with a higher level of privilege, perhaps access to wealth and resources. Yeah, I just think it's our charge to use those as thoughtfully and intentionally as we can, to do everything we can to maintain a livable planet for everyone, and to recognize that there's a lot of stuff coming our way, bad stuff coming our way, and we need to respond to those things with as much humanity and compassion as we can muster.
Well,
Thank
thank you. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Craig. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you to everyone who came. Once again, this will be on our YouTube channel for the Athenaeum. You can find it there if you want to listen again or share it with someone. And have a wonderful evening, everyone. Stay safe. And congratulations, Craig, on your new baby.
Thank you. Appreciate that very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.